Hello, this is Mr. Gideon. So now that we've defined what scarcity is and the fact that there is a problem when it comes to scarcity, that we have unlimited wants for limited resources, we're going to talk about how we try to address this problem, and it differs depending on what country you're in. But solving scarcity first has to differentiate between microeconomics and macroeconomics. The major focus of this class is macroeconomics. There is some microeconomic information, particularly in the next couple of lessons in the early part of the class, that is important to understanding the big picture. But that's really the difference between micro and macroeconomics. One zooms in on portions of an economy. It looks at individuals making decisions as consumers or entrepreneurs, looks at individual companies, sometimes industries or singular markets. But macroeconomics combines all of those individuals and those pieces of the larger puzzle. Macroeconomics then is the study of human behavior and choices as they relate to an entire economy. Most of the time in this class we focus on the U.S. economy, but many times we look abroad. We look at other countries as they wrestle with the same kinds of issues of scarcity that we have. For that reason, it's important to understand what an economy is. An economy is a system that coordinates choices about production with choices about consumption and distributes goods and services to the people who want them, even though we can't meet people's unlimited wants. So we quite frequently talk about goods or products. These terms are interchangeable, so I'd add them to your thesaurus, as well as services. Goods are anything that provide utility or satisfaction for the consumer. A bad is the opposite, anything that provides disutility or dissatisfaction, or perhaps harms the person who consumes that good or service. The United States has a market economy where production and consumption are the result of decentralized decisions made by firms or companies. Once again, interchangeable terms that you might want to add to your thesaurus for this class, as well as households or individual consumers. Doesn't mean that in our economy the government does not play an important role in deciding who gets how much stuff. But most of the decision making that happens on a daily basis is done by these two portions of our economy, companies and consumers, or individual households. Whether you're in the United States or in another country, as we try to address the problem of scarcity, an important piece of that is deciding how we handle what we call the factors of production. There are four major factors of production that are needed to assign who gets what goods and services, or to ration them out. Particularly in our case, these factors of production are controlled by the firms or companies that provide the goods and services. The four factors of production that you need to run a business, if you've taken business economics at Chaminade, you know this already, are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Land just refers to the physical space that a company would operate in. Labor refers to the workers, not necessarily the decision makers or the executives or the people that own the company, but the staff that are a crucial part of running a company, and quite frequently the most expensive part of running a company. Capital refers to two different kinds, physical and financial capital. Physical capital is typically the equipment, the machinery, the large purchases that go along with running a business. Financial capital is the cash, the financial resources that you will eventually, as an entrepreneur, turn into physical capital to produce whatever goods and services you're providing at a fee, and to service your customers. Most economists put entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship in a different category from labor, and that's why it's listed separately here, because entrepreneurs are in a different category in many ways than the average laborer for a company. That's because they're the risk takers. They're the driving force typically behind a company. They're the creators, and so they play a very unique role, particularly in a market economy or a mixed system that has elements of strong government oversight, but also market dynamics. When we're looking at solving scarcity, It's really important as we examine the different ideas that are out there, the different theories and models, that we understand the difference between positive and normative economics. Positive economics addresses what is. So it might make a statement. A positive economic statement would be the unemployment rate is 8.9%. Inflation is 4%. That's just stating the facts. While normative economics looks at what should be. This is opinion-based, obviously. And that's where the class really starts to get important and also interesting, where you have people that have won Nobel Prizes in economics with vastly different opinions about what should be done, what their normative economic theories are all about, can differ dramatically from one Nobel Prize winning economist to another. And so when we're talking about those theories and we're delving into how they sometimes find weaknesses in opposing theories, that's about normative economics. It's also important to understand the fallacy of composition, which is this mistaken view that what's good or true for an individual is necessarily good or true for the group. Not necessarily. So, for example, if somebody were to say, well, this would benefit General Motors as a company. If that's in fact true, it doesn't necessarily mean that the same policy would be beneficial to all people across the economy or for all companies. Might not even be beneficial for all of the major American auto producers. So that's an example of fallacy of composition. It's also important to think about the unintended effects of transactions between companies and consumers. Economists try to look at these unintended effects. They're called third-party effects, also externalities, and they can be positive or negative. So for instance, let's say that I want to sell you cigarettes, and you say, oh, thank God, Mr. Gideon. I've been looking around for cigarettes lately, and you came around at the right time, so I sell you cigarettes. This is a transaction, a form of trade between the two of us. You give me money for cigarettes, and then you light up, and somebody walks by that wasn't a part of this transaction at all, and they inhale your secondhand smoke, and later on develop cancer as a result of inhaling your secondhand smoke. This is a third party that wasn't involved in our transaction, yet they experienced an impact as a result of that transaction, or what we call an externality. I think we'd all agree that that would be an example of a negative externality. What would an example of a positive externality be? Oh, let's say now that I go shopping at your store and you produce clothing. And I go in there, I like the clothes that I see, I go ahead and buy those clothes, I wear them out, and I surprise my lovely wife when I get home with my new outfit, and she's very pleased the way I dress as a result of what I bought at your store. She fortunately gets to experience a positive externality, an upgrade, if you will, in my appearance as a result of the transaction between you and I. So there's all kinds of examples of positive and negative externalities, but externalities is just a fancy way of saying what's the impact to a third party that wasn't directly involved in the transaction between the seller and the buyer. Quite often in this class we look at theories or models to examine positive and normative, especially normative economics and externalities and the way to solve scarcity. And a theory or model is just an abstract representation. It's really an oversimplification of the world designed with the intent to better understand the world. A theory emphasizes only those variables that the theorists believe are the main or critical variables that explain an activity or an event. And so in that way, we have an oversimplification quite often when we look at these economic theorists that say, this is what we should do. Here's a normative economic statement I'm going to make to try to address unemployment, to try to address inflation right now. We judge these theories and their theorists based on how well they predict. If they're right a lot of the time in the predictions that they make, or the policy prescriptions that perhaps are implemented, then we judge them based on how effective they are and whether they work the way that they were predicted to. But when we talk about these theories and models, we always want to keep in mind a phrase known as ceteris paribus, or if you want a more literal translation, not a translation, but a pronunciation of this Latin term, ceteris paribus. But I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to say ceteris paribus because that's about all I can handle. But it means all other things held constant or nothing else changing. So we say, for instance, that a normative economic statement could be that if we cut taxes, our GDP will grow in the United States. That's a normative economic statement. It's a prediction. We don't want to neglect adding the phrase ceteris paribus, which means assuming nothing else changes, because we could cut taxes, and in fact that action could help GDP grow. But if something else that happens simultaneously has a greater impact, let's say there's a natural disaster that affects most of the country, which of course is unexpected, that could override any positive impact cutting taxes could take. And so, assuming nothing else, natural disaster or otherwise, takes place, I might say this variable, variable A, will lead to variable B. And that's what ceteris paribus is all about. Another example, a more simple example, could be your diet. And maybe I would make the statement, if you were to eat 3 gallons of ice cream every day, that would cause you to gain weight over time. Ceteris paribus. Assuming nothing else in your routine, exercise, diet, stress, other kinds of variables change. Ceteris paribus. Assuming nothing else changes. Because it's possible, I know some of you, you could eat 3 gallons of ice cream, but triple the amount of physical activity you had before you started eating that ice cream, and you might not gain weight. So, ceteris paribus is a very important phrase, especially because when we talk about theories and models, they're oversimplifications that typically look at just 2 variables. And reality is, when we're looking at life and social sciences, it's not a lab, and it's messy, and it's difficult to interpret results, and so we have to oversimplify and use this phrase.